Welcome back to Unmasking the Trans Movement with Jon Uhler. I'm your host, Brad Wilder. Last time on the show, James Parker was here all the way from Australia. We're proud to bring James back for part 2 right now. James, Jon, and Dr. Ann are with us today. Bring them all into the session. Thank you very much for joining us today, everyone. Jon, it was a great show on the first half. Maybe you want to kind of give a little bit of a recap with Dr. Ann, and we'll take it up from there with James on part 2.
Brett, thank you. We are in the midst of a very compelling interview with James Parker from Australia, originally across the pond. I'm still going to guess Australia is across the pond. I don't know what, if we're down under.
Other direction.
What's so powerful, James, about your story, and then I will turn things over to co-host Dr. Ann Gillies to do the formal introduction here in part 2. But what is so compelling is your personal story comprises so much of what I believe is very typical, if we can say it like that, of many of the kids, many of the young, troubled young people that are gender confused and that get sucked into the trans movement, that get exploited by the nefarious individuals embedded in that movement that are using that as a means to get their hands on kids, so to speak, access kids, and then exploit them. Because those kids come out of situations, many of them, that have been sexually abused, have had their sexual boundaries crossed. Many of them are on the autism spectrum, but you highlighted in your background, you came out of the foster care system. I'm aware of the fact that legitimate trans guy, Jen Smith in Canada, he came out of the foster care system. He is calling for a national inquiry into why so many kids, 40% of those kids that are being medicalized, come out of the foster care system. Yeah. Why? Because they come out of troubled backgrounds. And so the one thing they have a difficult time with, not only past trauma, but having had their intuition overridden, or they had to turn the volume down on that. So they have a hard time with reality testing and maintaining boundaries. So they are ripe for predation. And your story comprises so much of that. It is so compelling because you went to a clinician who was a genuine clinician. He looked for, he was mindful of, as his duty as a mandated reporter who is trained properly, to see the red flags, the clinical indicators, there's 9 primary ones, of those that have been sexually abused or have had their sexual boundaries crossed. So you are a tremendous example and story of those who, if allowed to get the healing they need rather than fast-tracked off to medicalization, they can truly begin that healing process. And this entire nefarious movement is robbing children, is keeping them from that healing. So Dr. Ann Gillies, you are an expert in trauma therapy. And so what a tremendous opportunity we have with James Parker. Thank you so much for connecting all of us. Dr. Ann, why don't you once again introduce James Parker, and James will have you pick up your compelling story.
Absolutely. Well, for those who are just coming in now, tuning in, and maybe missed the first part of this, I really encourage you to listen to part 1 and then also come back. But in the meantime, James, what an amazing story he has. And so he has gone from LGBT activist and certainly promoter of all things within the LGBT camp to someone who is outside of it and looking at a holistic picture of human nature, trauma, the issues that often precede certain types of behavior. And so, James, you've worked a lot with traumatized individuals, particularly traumatized men. So just pick up your story a little bit. After you actually had an experience, a religious experience with Jesus Christ, and that set you on a new path. out of the LGBT mindset and certainly out of the behavior. So why don't you pick up there and just tell us a little bit more about that, your relationship, and what really got you going into what you're doing now, helping survivors.
Well, so I mentioned in part one that I was in a long-term gay relationship when somebody asked me if I wanted more love in my life, and I said, well, who doesn't want more love in their life? And therefore I attended a gathering of very young Christians who literally were in what we call worship. They drew me into the presence of God, and I became aware, not too unlike an iPhone, that if you plug it in to the right source, it comes alive in a whole different way rather than just being an iPhone. And that was a bit like my life. I was given the opportunity to plug into God, if you like. I knew a lot about God. I'd been raised in a Christian home, not particularly overtly Christian, but a Christian home. But suddenly it was, using a biblical term in a sense, it was like I was being born again, for want of another way of putting it. But what happened is, there I am in the midst of this long-term gay relationship. And I just said, look, if anything stands in the way of your love, I'm sorry. I'd like to know your love. Who doesn't want more love? And to begin with, nothing changed. But I began to still my heart and my life for about 2 minutes a day. And I've always been very verbose and I can talk a lot. So for me to shut up was a miracle in itself. So by week number 8, I'd learned to sit really in silence for quite a number of minutes. And my boyfriend said, there's something different about you, to the point that he actually turned around and made a commitment to Jesus Christ. And for 6 months, we remained as a couple, but we began to pray, and we began to read God's word, and we began to worship. And we were actually raised up really as this archetypal Christian gay couple in London at that time. And we were considering going to the Netherlands to get a blessing, because there's no way that anybody in England would have given even a blessing on a gay couple. It shows how far the world has come in the recent news from the Church of England, that they're now willing to bless same-sex marriages and same-sex relationships. But in those days, the gay community hated marriage, hated it with a passion. But we wanted a blessing on our relationship. But as I began to move closer towards, if you like, towards the light, and these veils fell from my eyes, I slowly began to see, I began to see that my boyfriend, who himself had got sexualized trauma from the ages of 12 and 13, which is why he went into the military at the age of 16, I think, to try and prove his manhood. And then he left the military, and he didn't know how to deal with girls, because it was older girls that had sexually abused him as a young teenager. So he was still looking for something feminine, but he was frightened of women because his heart had been so deeply wounded. The environmental and emotional influences had affected his sexuality and his sexual attraction, everything about him as a sexual being. So therefore, I, as a very feminized, makeup wearing, kind of skinny camp young man, was very attractive to him. I became a replacement for what could have been a wife for him. And really deep down, because he was this big hulking man, he became a replacement for the father figure that deep down I was looking for. So both of us were basing love and sexuality and life commitment on trauma.
Wow.
So there's no way that ultimately that relationship could have become a fulfilling relationship. We could have continued in an eroticized friendship for the rest of our lives and actually been quite good friends. I'm not saying we couldn't have been. But when it comes to living life to the full and really experiencing the joy of what it means to live in your own skin, we would never have been able to do that. And that's why, even though I have friends who've been together 25, 30, 40 years in gay relationships, and they're my friends, I love these people. But I'm going to be honest, and I've told them sometimes to their faces, you can't experience the fullness of joy that you were created for by continuing to stay in that relationship as it is, and saying that that has the same value, the same merit, and that you can have the same deep life soul experience that exists in a relationship between a man and a woman. I know that because I went on from long-term gay relationships to long-term heterosexual relationships. Today, I'm a father, and I would never have been a father, having got married many years ago, if I hadn't had the opportunity to go through the therapy that I went through. So all my heart goes out for is those who never have the opportunity in a safe setting with an insightful therapist to explore these things. And this brings me on a little bit to some of the reasons why I write the articles I write, because I'm very, very concerned with this whole global anti-conversion therapy thing that's going on, which is actually trying to shut down the opportunity for rape victims, molestation victims, abuse survivors, all these different people from truly being able to access what they need to access in a therapeutic situation. And yes, nobody wants to see people with ice baths or forced into anything they shouldn't have. I wholeheartedly believe in client-led therapy. But there is much incredible therapy. It's proven to work in people's lives. And I'm seeing that working in people's lives here in Australia. And yet state by state by state, the opportunity to access therapy, and including the opportunity for a prayer, is deliberately being shut down by LGBTQIAP plus 2S protagonists, because they know that the therapy and the prayer will help people to deal with their trauma. And all that the trans movement is doing is basically, it's trying to celebrate and throw glitter in the face of trauma, and actually further traumatize people who've got every right to be able to deal with their childhood trauma. And the fact that governments, schools and others are jumping on board with this, that is in my mind, that is what is most diabolical of all, that they're running with a social concept rather than looking at biological reality.
There you go. And I am totally anticipating somebody trying to accuse us of promoting or suggesting, quote unquote, anti-conversion therapy. You just referenced it. So let me, for the viewer, be very clear on this concept, because as a therapist, Dr. Ann, as a therapist, we are very concerned about being precise and not being labeled what we are not. So first of all, we are not anti any group of people. We are for the protection of women and children and those that have been traumatized, those that have been abused, and those that are being exploited. Conversion therapy, the term, this is very important for people to understand. It is a manufactured term, and let me describe why in brief. When a cult, when a manipulator, when a sociopath, a psychopath, a perpetrator, when they are attempting to groom, meaning to overcome boundaries, to work, to mentally and emotionally manipulate, they're going to begin to draw their intended target of opportunity to themselves and away from those who genuinely are protective. That's why oftentimes they're going to divide child from family, from genuine biological, from their mother and father. That's why, by the way, they go after parental rights. So the predator, the perpetrator, the manipulator, the sociopath, psychopath is going to draw that child. They're going to groom that child emotionally. They're going to establish what the child thinks, the young teen thinks is a genuine relationship. It's not. Their trust, the young person, the target of opportunity is trusting. So they are drawn into what they think is a genuine relationship. They're being manipulated. So now when somebody comes along who sees that this is not a beneficial relationship, this is a relationship that is at the expense of the young person, oftentimes being sexually exploitive, to try to give that young person space to where they can begin to realize the nature, the possible nature of what's going on, which they may in fact have been manipulated and exploited. The manipulator, the predator, the perpetrator, the sociopath, right, cult leader, is going to, if they start to sense their property, no other way to put it, like a pimp, their property is starting to leave them, then the manipulator is going to decry whoever is trying to help that young person be free from the undue influence of someone who is manipulating and exploiting them. The perpetrator is going to say, don't you dare convert my property or my child. So what happens is, and it was a sleight of hand, a very serious and very effective spinning of language to where if anybody begins to break free from the undue influence of somebody that's exploiting them, the perpetrator cries, conversion therapy. So this anti-conversion therapy legislation, what it does is it prevents young people and others from having the opportunity to begin to explore their own values and what they really want. It used to be called values clarification, where no longer can a young person who's struggling be asked important questions that may in fact unlock past trauma. So I want people to understand we are not practicing, we are not advocating, we are not preaching, quote unquote, anti-conversion therapy. What we are advocating is this, that you allow a person who is seeking therapy to go through the process of clarifying their own values and determining and seeking or looking for answers to what may be deep woundedness. Do not hinder that important and vital therapeutic process. Let me ask Dr. Ann, anything you want to add to that? And then we're going to continue to hear from James and his compelling work with men with his survivor support network.
Well, yeah, and I do want to just clarify too that we as therapists and pastors and leaders, people who are caregivers and called to be caregivers in one form or another, are very much aware of how trauma affects lives and how it influences mental illness overall and mental health overall. And so not being able to deal with the trauma, it would have set you in a place, James, where you would have been in great turmoil for a long time. I think that that's the saddest thing I find, is that not being able actually to help the people who are genuinely wanting to be helped. And whether it's not about changing even an orientation, it's about helping them resolve. He was part of the LGBT for about 11 years, and he became very disillusioned and went for sex addiction therapy, not even really trauma therapy. But he was in therapy for quite a while, and he realized at the end of it that he didn't need an identity. And so it wasn't that anybody said or did anything that was opposing a homosexual lifestyle. It was that he came to this place of realization in his own life. And you see, that's what you're talking about, I think, too, John, is that there is this overarching sense where people are no longer allowed or given the consideration that they can know what's best for them. I'm talking about adults. And on the other hand, we have young children who are deciding what they think is going to be a resolution for their entire lives, and instead they're actually destroying their lives. So it's so convoluted. Anyways, I don't want to talk about that too much because I really want to hear from you, James. And you had kind of both of those things. You said early on in the first session that if you had have lived and been a young person in this day and age, you probably would have been trans. And
Absolutely.
I just listening to your testimony, I would agree that you would have been funneled into that. And it's such a destructive deception. Anyways, I'll quit talking. You talk now.
Well, what I didn't say is that at the age of 14, I contacted the lesbian and gay switchboard in the UK. Notice it was the lesbian and gay. It wasn't lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, transgender, anything else. None of that existed. It was just lesbian and gay, which shows how quickly things have changed, if you like. But within 2 minutes of that conversation of me saying that I found men, I was sexually attracted to men, they, at the age of 14, in this private conversation, they said, "You are gay. You have to accept this. This is who you are. And if you don't embrace it, you'll never be happy." Now, they were right to tell me I had to accept my same-sex attraction. They were right to do that. That was my reality. But to put a label on me and to tell me that's the way I would always be was actually an incredible crime against, it was abusive.
Yes.
It was sexually abusive against my identity at the age of 14. At that time, the age of consent in the UK was 21. So I was 7 years below the age of consent. And here is somebody on a lesbian and gay switchboard turning around and labeling me and giving me advice, knowing nothing about my history, knowing nothing about my addiction to hardcore pornography, even by the age of 14. And that's another topic, of course, that is causing so many of our young girls to want to transition, is they have been grossly traumatized by the violent pornography that many boys at the age of 9, 10, 11, 12 have been thrusting upon them and the way they're seen by boys. And we have to face that issue, that they're being directly sexually abused in a most traumatic way today than I think some of us can't even begin to imagine. But nevertheless, that's what happened to me. And really, overall, I ended up acting out behaviors that had been sewn into my belief system. This goes back to the mental health stuff. And what happened is my belief system, I came to understand, was a root of the vows that I'd made as a result of my trauma. So what happens is this is, having made these different vows, I want to explain what some of those vows are that I actually made. One of them was, I'll never be good enough to be with the boys. Therefore, I'm cut off from the boys. And then what happens is I'm trying to make myself fit in the world of girls, but I'm a boy, I don't really fit, until I start being sexually abused. And one of my abusers really deep down is transposing onto me his wish that I was female. And then when, of course, when my abuse finished at the age of 11 with him, because he'd found a long-term girlfriend, is I wished I was that girl. So these are different vows that I've made. These vows affected my beliefs, that affected my behaviors. So literally my mental world is upside down.
Yes.
So to not go and face the underlying issues that are there and the different comorbidities that were all clashing with each other means that what happens is I was living out of a false persona. And, you know, it's a bit like eating sand and believing that you're drinking water. And eventually you think, why am I dying? Because you're taking in the wrong input. Bit of a crazy example to use there, but it's like that. You end up in a place where you are absolutely and utterly dehydrated from everything that you need. And you're being led down into a rabbit warren, into a cul-de-sac. And that's what the trans movement today has been doing. They are screaming, shouting, and this goes back to a document by a guy called Paul Rondeau back in the 60s. It was called Selling Homosexuality to America. And Rondeau talks about 3 stages. He talks about desensitization. You talk about the topic so much that people just think, oh, it's that topic again. And they're desensitized to it. You go into Netflix and all it is LGBT, Disney Plus, LGBT. Everything is covered with the rainbow image to try and make out that LGBT is normal and okay. The next stage is jamming. And jamming means that if anybody questions anything about this topic, then what happens is you turn around and you say you're intolerant, you're bigoted, you're homophobic, and all these horrible words. Well, there's an extent to which sometimes I still experience same-sex attraction. I've got plenty of trans friends and gay friends. How can I be a transphobe or a homophobe if I've got all these friends whom I absolutely dearly love? I can't be. I've been told I'm a global conversion, therapist. Well, I believe in insightful, proven therapy that works. So that's the jamming session. The third section, rather than session, the third section is you've got desensitization, you've got jamming, then you've got conversion. And this is what they're doing. We could use the word grooming, yes, or indoctrination. And the LGBTQ plus community is a religion in its own right, with its own dogmas, with its own doctrines. And perhaps this has happened to your son, Anne, but if you leave the LGBTQ bandwagon, then what happens is you are excommunicated.
Exactly.
And then what happens is I am dealing with many older teenagers, 17, 18, 19-year-olds, who want nothing to do with the LGBT community. They're same-sex attracted. They're gender dysphoric, but they've done their research and they realize that this is actually really at its core, it is something diabolical. It's something really quite evil. And it's trying to cover everything in more glitter and more perversion and everything else, and trying to find connection through flesh rather than realizing that that's ultimately what we're made for. We're made for respectful, boundary.
You said flesh, and then, sorry, if we could pick it up from flesh, 3, 2, and 1.
And for many, they're just diving into fleshy relationships rather than going towards the heart and the soul, which is where true connection really happens between each other as humanity. And so really what's happening is they are being grossly stolen from. That basically the thief has come to try and steal, to kill, and to destroy who they are. And they can't live life to the full. And that's a reference, of course, to John chapter 10, verse 10 in the Gospels itself.
And I really want to go back to one thing you said, because I've said this a few times in the last 6 months, that the LGBT community is actually a religion unto itself. And in Canada, it is the religion of Canada right now. If we are not willing to sacrifice on the LGBT altar, if we are not willing to celebrate on that altar, then we're labeled, we are canceled, we're called all kinds of names, which, you are
the unclean infidels. You are infidels.
Yeah.
You are the pagans. You are the pagans of society. There is no content in you. You have no purpose and meaning. And yet the opposite is true.
Yes. And so what we try, we want to love people, we want to give them grace, but there is tremendous anger that I see. And there's also what I wanted to touch on this with you as well. When we think about the transgender and these young people, which is just, it just breaks my heart at what they're being instructed to do, it is like what John said, on this conveyor belt, all these children on this conveyor belt headed, to the surgery, to the clinics. And, what I was going to say there is that these are children, and how this new religion is sacrificing, just like in the Old Testament when they were sacrificing children to the gods of Moloch. We are in effect in our world now, the Western world, sacrificing our children to these gender clinics, and we're sacrificing them on this LGBT altar. And I don't know what we're going to do. I mean, I know that it's not getting any better here in Canada, but do you want to comment, James, a little bit on what you see happening within that whole trans movement and pushing children into that? Because I think it's on the cusp of something that's changing.
It is on the cusp of something that's changing, I think what's happening is, first, I want to give you 3 very, very brief stories, really brief. I have a lady who's 15 years in a lesbian relationship, and her lesbian partner wanted to get married to her. And my now friend, who'd been in this relationship 15 years, had a dream of hell. And it was so vivid, she believed she died. And she got to a point the next day, she split off the relationship. And she has just been flowering and blossoming within herself since finishing that relationship. Incidentally, her partner who wanted to marry her is now hooked up with a man. So don't tell me people don't change.
Yeah.
Another case is of a guy who was 19 years, who'd had surgery after 9 months of transitioning. And he was captain of the local women's soccer team for many years, made his children call him mother for 19 years. And then he basically ended up having this revelation. The veils fell from his eyes. He's totally rejected all that. He's come back to being a man, and he's now become a grandfather. And what an amazing man he is, even though his genitals have all been removed and amputated. I then got the story of a young man who, in his 5-year relationship, was driving in his car one day, and he had a sense of God saying to him, "This relationship is wrong, leave it." And after a few months, he left the relationship and didn't realize that his boyfriend was also wanting to leave the relationship because God was doing something with him. My point to you is how do we deal with this today? Is I'm watching very vulnerable young people who are broken rising up and speaking out in a way I could never have done at 18, 19. But they're actually saying this is lies. This is trauma, re-trauma, further trauma, and this has got to stop. And I just think we're going to see more and more young people standing up and speaking about this. And we need others, as many as possible, to do this. And for people like ourselves to support these people who got trauma to be able to stand up and speak. And only then do I believe will the tide turn.
That is exciting to hear that. And for many people, this will be a shock to them, thinking, does God really manifests that way in people's lives? That's just weird. But you know, I believe that totally. And the other thing I wanted to say, James, is that, you know, we have, as a society, created the greatest mental health crisis the world has ever known.
Yes.
And Brad was mentioning a little bit earlier, he wanted to just touch on what do you see the effects regarding mental health within this population. And there's severe mental health problems within the LGBTQ. What's your take on all of that?
I'm watching a community literally implode. We have LGBT alliances across the world now that are turning around and saying we want nothing to do with this transgender movement. This is literally it's creating mental health crisis, and also is against reality and biology and truth. And of course, they're right about that. So what's happening is we are beginning to see a community turn in on itself.
That's right.
And it's offering promises that it cannot sustain. And so this is why those of us outside of that community need to be ready to pick up multiple pieces, multiple fragmentations that are going to land on our doorsteps. And we've got to be ready to deal with that. In some ways, we've got a time of grace. This is a time where we've got to really build ourselves up strongly to be able to deal with as many people as we possibly can as everything begins to fragment. And I've said to my lesbian and gay friends, the transgender movement is ripping down your lesbian altar to everything feminine, and is ripping down your male altar to everything phallic and everything to do with the masculine. It's all being ripped down. We're not allowed even to have those two terms. So you're going to wake up to the fact that this agenda that you think you're following is a truly and utterly false agenda. And like you, my heart goes out to these people. They've got every right to be able to live a full life as much as they can, and they have no idea that their eyes have been veiled and that they're being lied to.
Yeah, and that just is so sad, because the lies have become so embedded. And what we need to see is the veil of darkness lift. And that, to me, there is only one way that can lift, and that is by God bringing revelation into people's lives. Because when darkness is so dense, right, there is only one way. It's only the light that can penetrate into that depth of darkness. You wanted to say something?
Right. That's right. I was just going to say that I think that's, and we need to look very carefully at why the LGBTQ ideologues and protagonists, and I use those words deliberately, this is not our average nephew or niece or uncle, whoever's just trying to live a happy life. Nobody's judging anybody there, but I am standing in judgment of the leaders who are very deliberately trying to ban therapy. And now, particularly in the state of Victoria here in Australia, have banned any form of prayer whatsoever, unless it's affirmative. Why would they do that unless they knew there was power in that prayer? And there is. That's partly what changed my life. I'm seeing that change many other people's lives. They want to shut down every single doorway they possibly can. They want to get these kids from drag queen story hour as little tiny toddlers through to lying to them in the early stages of school, to the point whereby they then rip them away from their parents in their teenage years, so they've got them for life. If that is not indoctrination and public child sexual abuse, what is?
Exactly. You know, and this is why I'm kind of dependent on that implosion. It's so interesting you use that word. I just right now have a book at the publishers called Implosion, and it's talking about that very thing. So So it's really neat to talk to you halfway around the world and hear the same words come out of your mouth. I think that's what we're seeing. I think we're going to see it more and more. It's kind of like this wave that started. I talked about this earlier, and John, you can jump in here. This wave that will become a tsunami that is going to take place. And the only thing that is, the thing that's sad about this is picking up the pieces. And the reality is the church, globally, the church at large is not ready. I mean, they are so inept at dealing with these situations. And because the culture has so invaded the church, they have gone along with all of this gender, all of the gender stuff. I hear pastors using the word gender instead of sex from the pulpit, and it just makes me cringe. I'm like, oh, please, because they've been so captivated by the media. So we have to do a lot of work in the church to get it ready and to be able to help those who come. And of course, for therapists, therapists have been taught you don't deal with these things. So only those of us who have been trained in trauma and understand that helping people at their very core and the very roots is going to work. And so we need to really encourage that. John, you've kind of been left in the background here. I'm sure you have questions.
I'm just aware of the fact that the clock is our great nemesis. James, I'm so appreciative that you have been willing to be our guest in case, again, people are going to try to misconstrue our words. What we advocate here on Unmasking the Trans Movement is for the healing of those who have been severely and significantly abused, exploited, traumatized, and manipulated by those that are seeking to profit or prey upon those that are deeply wounded. And James, you are advocating, Dr. Ann, myself, Brad, along with us, we advocate for healing of the whole person rather than simply fast tracking wounded people off to a medical solution, which is no solution, because these young people will be sterilized and amputated for life. That does not heal deep wounds. These young people need help. They need awareness. They need holistic healing, body, soul, and spirit, mind, will, and emotions. We should not be afraid to let people know that, listen, healing is comprehensive, and we need to be able to address and talk about as many things as possible so that people can ultimately clarify their own values and find the healing they need. So thank you so much for being a part of our program, Dr. Ann. Thank you for being a tremendous co-host. And Brad, thank you as always.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much for being here today, James. Just before we go, coercion, extortion, things like that, the accountability of this all needs to come to light. I believe that will be on a future show soon enough. The movement itself and the ideology are more than concerning and disturbing, and the help that Unmasking the Trans Movement with Jon Uhler provides is not only for those that have been affected already by it, but those who are living through it from a parental or a grandparent perspective. And we're helping you, I guess, find some sort of a path through this to make sense and give you clarity to understand that this, what I like to call is a fad or a trend, is something that obviously we cannot let go any farther than exactly that, a fad or a trend. Thank you very much to all of you for being on the show today. This is Unmasking the Trans Movement with Jon Uhler. I'm Brad Wilder, your host. I'll see you next time. Remember, take care of each other and take care of yourself. I'll see you soon. We are